The Deep Breathe software is effectively trying to take the brains of ultrasound experts like me and you, Resa, and many of our colleagues, and put it in a piece of software. And so ultimately, we would imagine, just as you've likely done, where you're standing in the room with someone else who knows how to use ultrasound, and you give them that second opinion that boosts their confidence and leads to a more confident diagnosis or exclusion of a problem. And the kind of problems we're looking at include punctured lung like a pneumothorax, which can be a life-threatening condition, things like heart failure, which is a serious chronic condition, things like blood in the chest like a hemothorax and pneumonia, all sorts of conditions. And so we'd love to give those diagnostic capabilities to everybody and sort of bring the expertise to people without needing the expert in the room.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa Lewiss. Audience, today we're talking about AI in healthcare, another episode in our AI in healthcare series. Joining me from London, Ontario, Canada, is Dr. Rob Arntfield. Rob has described himself as an acutivist. That's an emergency medicine and a critical care physician at the London Health Sciences Centre. He's a professor of medicine at Western University and co-author of the textbook Point of Care Ultrasound. Tying in the AI in healthcare thread, he's the founder and CEO of Deep Breathe, a healthcare AI company. So, a little bit of history on Deep Breathe. In 2020, Rob began work with a research team at Lawson Health Research Institute to investigate how AI systems can be used to diagnose COVID-19 using pattern recognition in lung ultrasound. During the project, the lung ultrasound learning model for intensive care unit patients demonstrated high accuracy in identifying what we call B-lines. The system also demonstrated high accuracy and surpassed physicians in detecting COVID-19 via these lung point-of-care ultrasound examinations. The system became the first product for Deep Breathe, which Rob founded in 2021. Rob, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Thanks, Resa, for having me.
In the intro, I talked about COVID-19 and how that was a real game changer, story starter for you when it came time to deep breathe. It also was a full circle moment with your history of studying computer science and coding. For me, that was when I started this podcast and started writing for outlets outside of our medical and scientific journals. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more with the audience about that connectivity and those roots.
Yeah, well, I really love hearing about something I didn't know about you, about how what this podcast brings you into something outside of medicine that maybe was dormant in you or hibernating in you. And so I think there's this latent or dormant process in me that was my background in computers and kind of a unlikely tech nerd. And the sort of maturation of my career in ultrasound was leading toward an interest in maybe rediscovering some of those roots and finding a way to link them together with the love of ultrasound, as well as the inherent inefficiency in the way we teach ultrasound. No matter how efficient and how ambitious we are, we still just can't reach all the people we'd like to reach with it. And so there was a number of Venn diagrams that were Venn diagram circles that kind of overlapped and came alive around the 2019 pre-COVID era, and then were accelerated by some of the discoveries and the opportunity to study a very tidy ground truth project the way COVID did for many burgeoning researchers.
So one of the things that you just shared made me think about quiet and noise. And there was a time during that period where we all had the ability to be quiet in certain ways, which allowed certain things to resurface, reemerge. You've talked about AI and the signal to noise, and I'd love it if you'd share your thoughts on that framework with the audience.
Yeah, I mean, you've linked some two really interesting concepts there. The one that, the pandemic created a forced solitude, even for those of us who are obviously active as physicians and managing things. When we leave the shifts, you still didn't have a lot to do. And so, finding your own signal maybe is easier with less noise. And yeah, for many people, the pandemic obviously fostered that internal growth. Within the AI space, the signal to noise ratio, I don't know where it stands now, but certainly at the time, it was much less obvious what the coming AI was. And that always bothered me. Not sort of, I don't need to know how everything works, but, I don't need to know how my microwave exactly heats the food. But at some level, I want to have a cursory understanding so that if I'm going to be overtaken by a paradigm shift in in humanity in some ways, that I have some semblance of what the underlying architecture is of the very instrument that's telling me that I'm approaching a stop sign with my self-driving car, or that something is spammed in my inbox. So that thirst to kind of understand the underlying piece was distinguishing signal from noise. That's what it meant for me.
Yeah. I've spoken with a few of Visible Voices podcast guests about AI in healthcare, and everybody notes, AI didn't just start in this recent period. In fact, there have been a few periods of AI, and you referenced in one of your recordings the imitation game with Benedict Cumberbatch. And I'm wondering if you can share how that ties in AI for people that hadn't made that connection.
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a historian in the field by any means, especially if I'm clearly just getting my historical knowledge and citing it on other podcasts from Hollywood. So you may just be exposing the shallow nature of my knowledge here. And yet I'm drawn often by the history of, the very, in many ways, shallow history of what are formidable sort of changes in our lives, or features of our lives. The history of medicine is a great example, which, again, the very shallow history of medicine, the history of oncology, or these other fields that are, again, just huge parts of our life that if you look back even 50 years, they don't resemble what they do today. And so I think, for me, understanding that obviously very smart mathematicians and logicians have figured out the theoretical concepts of AI, but we've only finally begun to arrive into the computing power and the data access that brings that sort of imagined state to life. It's such an exciting story because it allows you to frame where you are at in that moment. And again, it may solve some of the overwhelm that we might feel to realize that this is very much just a very recent history, and we are in the process of writing it.
Yeah, beautifully shared. So deep breathe. The audience is like, Resa, get to AI, point of care ultrasound, and deep breathe. So Deep Breathe provides artificial intelligence software, tell me if I get this right, to automate the interpretation of lung ultrasound images. So the software can be utilized with a handheld device, and it rests upon an archive of lung ultrasound images, which is the largest in the world and spans over a decade of clinical research.
That's right. So the vision behind Deep Breathe and the reason for lung ultrasound is, you obviously your audience may or may not know just what a boss level ultrasonographer and ultrasound expert you are. And perhaps they know that already, but for their sake, it would be important to understand that lung ultrasound, just like the shallow history in many ways of AI, is even has the most recent history of any sort of transformative imaging technique that's portable, in the sense that it was long believed that the lungs could not receive ultrasound or generate ultrasound images of meaningful information for clinical interpretation. And so, as such, data sets in that field are suitably rare, because people like Resa and I have only been using it for 20 years or so, or people in our field. And so, unlike x-rays or other techniques that have lots and lots of data over decades, there's a very limited set of data to drive the AI accuracy that we need. And so that's sort of why we started there as a group, because we have a natural advantage as point of care clinicians or frontline clinicians like emergency doctors and intensive care doctors. And if I, at the risk of being long-winded, I will add the sort of the educator's dilemma that we can educate, as many of us do painstakingly, to educate clinicians to use these technologies. By my own estimation, I've educated thousands of clinicians, and yet there's just a few 100,000 more to go. And so even the mark of a very devoted career can leave you just scratching the surface. And so finding a way of actually scaling the expertise that you and I are lucky enough to have, Resa, to give it to everybody, comes through this technological kind of advancement. And so it's the satisfaction of the original educational mandate or ambition that I think you and I probably started with.
Some words that come to mind are intention, impact, and return on investment. I love how you have sort of added to your hats that you wear: physician, researcher, educator, and now startup entrepreneur. And you've mentioned that sometimes when you're starting something, you have to invest your own money. And not all startup people do that or speak about that. I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit of the thought process with that.
Yeah, I think, for those of us who have day jobs and fortunate enough to have day jobs, to work in healthcare especially, it's a satisfying career. And, and many other folks with their pursuits, might have a great idea. And the question is, what's it worth for you to not follow that idea. And so sometimes in medicine, we look for grant money, for instance, or we look for someone else as a sign that we're on the right track. But sometimes you can't know you're on the right track until you get the first step started. And so the bad first draft, as we like to talk about, is a very powerful something on paper that you can iterate on. And so in the case of a startup, or even just moving an idea forward, it's going to take a bit of money and time, and ultimately, I think, what's it worth to you to follow that lead without knowing where it goes, the same way we would buy any product, or perhaps pursue formal education like a mid-career MBA or something would be very common. People invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into that. So I think it's a very similar approach of just backing yourself, believing that putting some skin in the game will create accountability to yourself. There's a very positive feedback loop that comes from, I think, putting some of your own resources, particularly money, into the middle to say, okay, I'm going to go a level deeper and then see what happens. And pretty soon you end up recording a couple hundred podcast episodes by following that playbook, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah. On another episode, I spoke with a guest about EKGs and EKG interpretation, that there's an AI aspect to this. But you actually distinguished that if we think about EKG and AI algorithms, these are non-learning models. They're
Mm-hmm.
hard coded in.
Mm-hmm.
That's different than what you're doing in terms of machine learning with deep breathe. So can you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, the intelligent systems that typical EKG sort of auto interpretations are built on, are not necessarily built on the modern model of either, for computer vision, we use a lot of what are called convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. And whereas in some ways you can, a purist would tell me that the EKG interpretations are in fact AI, in the sense they do mimic human intelligence. However, they're not built in a way that allows them just to be fed more information and to get smarter over time, as you describe. So this bridges actually to the regulatory considerations of AI, which, in many ways we'd be better off if those EKG systems or anything with an output could be then verified the same way that we're asked to verify self-driving car data every time we sign in on a website and ask us to pick all the crosswalks or stop signs or motorcycles. I don't know if your audience would know that that's what they're helping do. In addition to verifying their humanity, their humanness, I should say, they're actually verifying data. So if we had a pathway to tell the EKG whether it got it right or not, and for it to learn, that would be ideal. And the question is then, do we make it smarter or dumber in that process, which then is a risk for any kind of medical instrument. And so the opportunity at hand is to take advantage of the learning nature of these models and make them get better over time. But at some point, we have to say the model's good enough to go into the market or go through regulatory approval. And for the time being now, that's kind of the how you get stuck with, so to speak. Meaning it doesn't have, the FDA and other groups are working on ways to try and allow it to learn and get better as it's released in the market.
I know that you were awarded a grant through the US Army.
Mm.
Plus, you're doing monthly hackathons, which strike me as amazing healthcare design projects to iterate and make you and your team and your product better. So, can you describe these initiatives?
Yeah. So initially, I'm a civilian. I've never served in armed forces. And initially, what we're designing for diagnostics was intended with civilian use cases where perhaps trained physicians could get a second opinion, lesser trained physicians could mimic experts, nurses or respiratory therapists could achieve sort of expert level precision with making some observations in the lungs with ultrasound without a lot of training, overcoming the training burden. But when you think also about other spaces where portable imaging, portable diagnostics can live and be useful, the military environment was presented to us. We entered a Army sort of evaluation process for international companies, being a non-American company, and we were sort of seen as bridging a serious capability gap in military medicine, where something called needle thoracostomy, where if a wounded warfighter is suspected of having what's called a pneumothorax or a punctured lung, the treatment, which is a large needle between the ribs in most cases, is done empirically without any hard diagnostic techniques. And so we, by enabling ultrasound to be used to automatically screen for that condition, we offer again, we bridge a capability that isn't there, and perhaps provide an accuracy that would be desirable for anyone who's faced with having to to stick a needle between the ribs of one of their fallen brethren. So that was last year. It was about a year ago. We've gone on to engage with various armed forces kind of throughout the world, but especially the Department of Defense has been really welcoming of this capability, which has been extremely rewarding to be in that kind of community of people where technological excellence is prioritized over just about anything. And for those of us in medicine like me and you, we know that that's the cycle of technology adoption. Medicine is very, very slow. And I'm reassured to see that doesn't need to exist. Even in large systems like the armed forces, they can adopt things a little bit more liberally. So it's been a very pleasant cultural welcoming from them.
It's a beautiful example of human-centered design
Mm.
and patient-centered care.
Mm.
So these hackathons.
Yeah. So a hackathon is a term that our engineering team use for our monthly sort of long form retreats where we, precisely as you allude to, we stare at sort of the problems that are yet unsolved within what we can achieve with our data and our clinical team. And the real magic happens with this sort of exchange between engineers and clinicians who really have no business being in the same room together in some instances, come and we're amazed by them and they tend to be somewhat amazed by what we deal with. And there's this beautiful sort of exchange and reciprocity that seems to happen. It's a bit musical in its nature. If you had somebody playing the French horn and somebody playing a banjo in the room together, like, it's not obvious you could make music with those two instruments. And so yet here we are. And so we do sort of pick away at the unsolved questions that we can uniquely solve. And each time we do one of these, we realize our capabilities have grown and we can tackle more and more. And so it's a coming together of those divergent capabilities in long form to make some progress on our mission.
Yeah, it's great and it sounds fun. You mentioned with the military Department of Defense that things get implemented, they're ready to go. But oftentimes, and in this way, AI and point of care ultrasound are a bit analogous, there's resistance. People are slow to change and culture is slow to change. And it's a little bit of well, I've always done it this way, I've always practiced this way. And even though, I'm 25 years into using point of care ultrasound, literally there's still the people that do it and believe in it and a lot of people that avoid it in their clinical practice. So do you see them, AI and POCUS, as resembling each other? And are they going to continue on this pathway, or will AI uptick and grow and be more accepted?
Yeah, it's a super thoughtful question. I think your meta question is: is there a subgroup of people where just innovation scares them? And that's a pejorative way of framing it. And they're conservative people and they're good at what they do and they may not need the assistance in their view. And I can think of clinicians who maybe aren't assisted with ultrasound, and I can think of clinicians who use ultrasound maybe to their own peril at times. We've probably seen those clinicians. And I could think we could imagine people maybe misusing AI, not necessarily in a bad or malevolent way, but perhaps using it to, accidentally. And I've received emails that I think clearly are written by AI, and I would much prefer a less well-crafted, janky, poorly grammatically strung together email that was a bit more authentic. And so I think there's perils on both sides. And obviously I'm an optimist about innovation, and you are obviously as well. I would say that the curious people for curious people, like deeply curious people, these two technologies resemble each other, and they're both kind of irresistible in their own way because they multiply your capabilities as a doctor with the way ultrasound does. And a lot of AI solutions can really multiply our capabilities as humans if, again, used correctly and in synergy with our own natural gifts as either doctors or humans at large.
And you have aptly, I want to use that word, aptly described the situation as a lot of AI in healthcare has been deployed, but not a lot has been studied.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And a lot of AI in healthcare is currently really directed at analysis of big data. I think of the electronic medical records and sort of early warning systems and these types of things, where they're looking for patterns that sort of sit above the cognitive level of the clinicians who may not be paying attention, but who haven't yet had the chance to assimilate all the data. And yeah, there's a bit of a gap there for sure. I think partly the challenge for most of these things is to solve problems that most people don't feel like doing themselves. If you automated I don't know, let's say cooking. A lot of people enjoy cooking. If you automate someone's cooking process entirely, some people don't like ordering in. That'd be the form of automating cooking, I guess. Uh, but if you automate like the mincing of the garlic or something of the sort, the less pleasant parts, people are like, oh yeah, I'll take that, but don't take the whole process. And so I do think there's sort of a part of the AI for decision making and synthesizing all the facts, like the blood work and the imaging and the longevity and your love line on your left palm and all of the details, and trying to then come up with a like a prediction of a date of death, or whether you're going to get sepsis in the next 10 years or whatever the case is. I think there's an inherent distrust, and there's also like that's literally what we do, and so there is a bit of existential threat there as well. Whereas if you just automate a portion of that, that the nuisance parts of it, like for instance, we're focused on pneumothorax or a punctured lung with our AI, which is a very cool diagnosis to make in the emergency department. We're not actually looking to automate it in the emergency department because I think doctors like making that diagnosis in the emergency department. But you know who doesn't like making that diagnosis is all the screening tests we do after invasive procedures in the hospital all day long. After you get a central line or a chest tube removed, you screen for a pneumothorax. Those are chest x-rays or imaging tests that no one takes particular pride in as a clinician, I don't believe. They're mostly screening and nuisance level workflow tasks. And so we believe that people are going to be quite happy to offload that responsibility. And so choosing the right AIs to study and to implement in the right areas, I think we can create kind of a waterfall approach of adoption rather than trying to kind of lead with sort of a grand theorem of all of medicine all at once, which I think is somewhat of the peril of some approaches right now.
Yeah, and I'm going to tie this in a little bit to your ICU patient care because clinically, you work these days in the ICU, not in the emergency department, although you did plenty of time there and you're trained in both. Uh, you said something that stopped me in my tracks. You've talked about intentions in medicine, and this is a little, you also make sports references, a little inside baseball, um, sort of a look behind the curtain. Our intentions in medicine are often deciding, is it relevant or not relevant? Do we put the accelerator on the gas or do we let off? And that ultimately we're imposing suffering on people and looking for a return on investment. And I'm wondering what you were thinking about when you shared that, and how does that inform deep breathe and the use of ultrasound in the ICU?
Whoa. Okay, that's like at the heavy. That's right at the ethos of my clinical practice, which is as an intensive care physician, we are responsible for using the tools that can extend life in a responsible way. Acknowledging the cost of doing so is deeply traumatizing, both physically and psychologically, to people if they're used inappropriately, and that's both the patients, their families, as well as the providers. So it's a really high risk game that we're playing. You know, we yeah, using that's a heavy it's a responsibility I carry very heavily if I get it wrong, particularly if I just favor life at all costs and say that the technology that we have should be used to extend life indefinitely because that's everyone's instinct. And so that shrewdness, I think, is something that I struggle with about how to maximize the return on investment for everybody. And so I don't know, if I were being honest, Risa, I don't know if there's a direct link to Deep Breathe that I've made in that regard, other than my wish selfishly is to believe that the things I know everyone ought to know, which is perhaps inherent in being a professor, that you have a pulpit you can sort of speak from, or perhaps a podcast you can riff from. If I'm getting too close to home, let me know, where you wish to convey and give to people the perspective you've worked hard to get, whether it's as an ultrasound leader or whether it's as somebody who stared at the end of life across thousands and thousands of people, and you'd wish to give them some guidance and some wisdom about when to step on the gas, to use your expression, or when to pump the brakes. And a lot of us just know where the accelerator is in medicine, and because it's safest to say, well, I tried and I tried and I tried and I tried, but then the patient died. Sometimes, again, there's things worse than death. And I think flailing around with an accelerator without knowing the brake pad is also is a reckless practice, which I'm trying to urge others to manage in themselves as well.
Really, really, really appreciate that share. And I'll make the thread because I see what you're doing with AI, ultrasound, and deep breathe as patient-centered care, safer care. So you don't have to be as invasive. And you use the example of the needle when there's a collapsed lung. What if you don't need to do that needle versus, just blindly placing it because you don't have the technology and the imaging to see inside the body? So I actually think that there is that thread. And, what you shared, many of us walking through medicine as healthcare professionals do carry that very, very seriously and are always aware. And so I think you actually described it quite authentically and quite well. And it's a perfect time for me to ask you about your voice. When did you realize you had a voice, and when did you start using that voice? And you can define it in whatever terms you want, but you clearly are a visible voice in healthcare, in medicine, in intensive care unit medicine, in this AI ultrasound space.
So yeah, it's a beautiful question, and obviously at the heart of the podcast itself. And yeah, I think I consider myself an accidental member in some ways of, maybe we all should consider ourselves accidental or lucky members of a group of people who have been given a voice by your colleagues. It certainly was never that expected on my side. And I think there's maybe just an authenticity that people have been oriented to in the way I speak, because and so I think initially it was the technology adoption, being an early adopter in the ICU space with ultrasound, of whom there are many. And ultimately, I think it was the genuine love of that technology for its own sake that I think ultimately became a bit infectious for others, the good kind of infectious, of course, in ways that I honestly, there's a bit of an alchemy there that I can't totally explain. And I guess I was flattered by, in many ways, people I looked up to asked me to kind of join in the conversation with them, and people whose voices I looked up to and said, hey, come join the conversation, much as the invitation to join this conversation with you today is flattering. When Brett Nelson, who trained me at Mount Sinai, or Paul Mayo, who's also a fellow New York intensivist, said, hey, come with us, Rob, and contribute to the conversation. It's this deeply moving opportunity to mentor under them, but also contribute. And that's, I think, just kind of has cascaded over the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. For people that want to follow your work and see where you go next with Deep Breathe, first, can you give us a sneak preview of where you're going next with Deep Breathe, and how can they follow along you and your team's work?
Yeah, we're going many places, it seems, in the sense that portable diagnostics and diagnostic outside the hospital environment, for instance, which ultrasound is uniquely capable of offering, whether you're on a space station or in a dairy farm, or in a battlefield or in a submarine, or coal miner, and you need lung screening. There's just a dizzying number of possible applications, which, again, back to your point, I think generally will create efficiency for people, time, accuracy, these great things truths we would all orbit around. And so we are focused primarily on military medicine, pre-hospital medicine, and sort of in-hospital medicine for the time being, and sort of spending our time in those spaces. And the work we're doing is featured. I think we use social media probably not as aggressively as some do. We're busy doing the work, and we recognize we're grateful to have a bit of a following. And LinkedIn, I would say, is cringy or not cringy, you make the decision, audience, but is where we post our wins and maybe our losses as well. It's the best place to find links to our new journal articles, as well as our business activities and our personal relationships with partners.
Rob, thanks so much for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast.
Thanks so much, Resa.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa Lewiss. Find me at Resa Lewiss MD on social media, or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the opinions of their institutions. Information shared here should never substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.